Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a snowy landscape. I'm going to be using the wet in wet painting method, and I'm going to completely wet my sky. So I'm going to start off by drawing in just a vague horizon line just below the halfway point. I'm going to put in some trees, just a vague shape of where they will be, and then going to sort of bring the pencil down to show the slope of the land really, and it's just a simple guide so I can see where to put my paint. I'm using 100% cotton Saunders Waterford cold pressed 140 pound paper. It's best to do this kind of painting on cotton paper because it stays wetter for much longer. Whereas pulp paper, you've only got a couple of minutes, and it's all right if you can paint quickly, but it's much easier with cotton paper. Now I'm wetting the whole of my sky with my small hake brush. My paper's taped to my board, and my board is at an angle of about 45 degrees, and so that the paint will diffuse and run wet in wet. Just sweeping some water across the land. I don't want as much water on the land. I want some dry patches across there so that we can get soft and hard edges in the landscape. I'm mixing up indigo, paynes grey and a dab of alizarin crimson just to get a sort of slightly warm greyish blue. This scene will be mostly monotone really. I mean, you could put more pink in if you wanted, or rather the alizarin crimson, but I'm going to stick with sort of the blue colours and tones. Now I want a nice graduated wash across the sky, darker at the top, getting paler towards the bottom, so you can see the paint running down the wet page, and I'm just helping it with a little bit more water. So that it goes from dark to light. Right, I'm going to turn my board around now just to help the wash to settle and to stop it running down quite so much. This is one of the beautiful things about painting wet in wet with watercolour, is that you can control your washes by moving the page around, tilting it this way and that, and just keeping an eye on where the paint is flowing until it pretty much looks how you want it to look. I think it's just about settled enough so that when I turn it round the right way, it will just gently diffuse and soften rather than flooding down. I'm going to paint in my snowy foreground now and midground. I'm going to take the same mixture, maybe a dab more of the alizarin crimson into it. But not too much. I mean, that's personal preference. If you want some pinky tones in the snow, add a little bit more. Now with a small hake brush, I'm just sweeping the paint across where I drew in the lines for the landscape, and I'm sweeping across the horizon line as well. I'm getting some nice soft and hard edges already where the sky is wet and the land is partially dry. Now I'm just dabbing in some slightly stronger dabs of indigo and paynes grey, just here and there, just to indicate shadows and movements and shape of the ground. I'm just going to clean up my horizon line a little bit. I'm going to put a bit of heavier paynes grey across that foreground slope, and I'm going to just reinforce with stronger paint across the horizon line where my tree line is going to go. Now the paper is still very wet, So I'm making up a very thick, almost tube consistency mixture of indigo and Payne's grey for my trees. You can see how thick it is. If it wasn't thick, then this paint would fade away, it would run off. It needs to be thick in order to stick on the wet paper, but to still diffuse softly around the edges. So we're keeping our nice dark winter trees, but they're diffusing very softly around the edges. Now, as I run out of paint on the brush, you can see that on the left side the trees look slightly lighter, and now this works well because the left side of my painting is picking up the light from the sky. Now I've just got literally paint water on my brush and whatever's left in my brush, and I'm just going to pull a little bit of pale tone through underneath those trees. I want to still leave most of that paper there white and unpainted. I'm just going to tidy up underneath the trees a little tiny bit with a clean damp brush. Now I've changed to my, I think it's a number 2 or a number 3 rigger, Dale Arowney graduate rigger, and I'm mixing up the same mixture but to an inky consistency, and I'm just going to carefully brush across the still wet base of the trees just to define that horizon line a little bit more. Maybe pop in a trunk or two for the trees, nothing much. And I think that's nearly it for the first stage. In fact, that's nearly it for most of the painting. If we zoom in and have a quick look, we can see how pretty some of the marks are, just like that, where the paint is softly diffusing, and we've got soft edges, hard edges, suggestions of foreground. Now, just before I leave it to dry, I'm just going to use the corner of a cut-up store card to drag through the trees, through the wet paint, and just to etch out a few tree trunks and branches. I'm not going to do too many. At the moment it's very wet, so I'm not etching out paint to produce, to go back to the white of the paper. It's making little scratches and they're filling in with the wet paint, so I'm getting sort of dark lines. I mean, you can do this with the rigger brush when it's dry if you prefer, but I quite like to pull in a few of these etched marks first and then let it dry, and then reinforce those marks with some rigger painted trees. Now I'm going to leave it to dry for a little bit longer, and then I'm going to try and see if I can etch in some of those sort of white marks by moving the paint, but I need it to dry a bit more, so I'm going to have a nice cup of espresso coffee first while I wait for it to dry. Now I've looked at the trees and they are dry enough to, I can see that the paint is just a little bit damp, so I can pull the card through and you can see that I'm creating white marks. I'm going back to the white paper with the corner of the card this time, and that just adds a little bit of variety, as if the light is picking up some of the trunks. Try a little bit on this side, although because the paint is thinner there, that's drier, so I can't get quite as many marks in that, so I think that will do. Now it's time to step back from it, not fiddle with it anymore, and just leave it to dry, and I'll see you and we'll finish the painting off shortly. Right, and it's all dried, and it's dried very nicely, so I think all I'm going to do is just add a few more trees. So I'm going to mix up the same mixture of indigo and Payne's grey. And using my rigger, I'm going to just paint in a few trees over and around where I have etched the marks in, just to add a bit more definition to the trees. And this is where, if you didn't want to etch, then you would paint in all of your branches, your skeleton tree branches. Remember to taper off your brush stroke towards the end of the branches so they become narrower and finer. I'm not going to cover the whole of these tree areas with marks. I'm going to allow some of those softly diffused marks to look as if they are more distant trees, where you can just see the shadow and the shape rather than all the branches. And a few more over this side. Trying to keep my marks as thin as I can. I don't think I'm going to do very much to it. You could, of course, add a fence. You could add some people, maybe some birds. But I think I'm just going to use the rigger to add a little bit of texture here to the foreground. And then I'm going to bring over some grasses coming in from the tape at the bottom, across, just leaning into the picture across this darker patch in the corner, just to look like some tufts of grass that are poking out from the snow. Maybe bring a few more along here. I mean, your painting will probably look different to mine, so wherever it looks like you think you just need a few bits of grass poking out through the snow, can look very effective. But as I say, you could add a fence across here or across the tree line, birds, people, anything really. So let's remove the tape, pulling the tape carefully away from the picture so that you don't tear into your picture if your masking tape was to be a bit too tacky. And here's the finished painting. Removing the tape and seeing that nice clean white border really brings the painting together. And if we zoom in and look at it a little bit closer, you can see the soft wet in wet diffusion, where we've just added the paint wet in wet. And the sky as well is quite atmospheric. It looks as if it's laden with more snow. So I'm hoping that you can see here that if you leave enough of the paper unpainted and are very quite subtle with your brush strokes for the foreground, that you can end up with a very simple but very beautiful snow scene. Well, I hope you found that useful, and I hope you'll give it a try. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to my patrons for your support. I really appreciate it. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon, please follow the link below. Thanks so much, and I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.